Dust clung to the sweat and grime on the faces of Alexander's men as they passed through the colossal gate of all nations. Their worn leather armor and chipped spears were a stark contrast to the towering stone bulls and lameshu that guarded the entrance, their majestic forms untouched by the wear of war. Ahead lay the royal road, leading to the heart of Persepolis. The city was not a teeming metropolis, but a sprawling complex of breathtaking, silent grandeur. The Macedonians, veterans of Granicus and Issus, moved through the vast, empty plazas with a superstitious awe, their footsteps echoing in a space built for thousands. They were an army of ghosts trespassing in a palace of gods. Alexander himself walked with a measured pace, his famed resolve tempered by a strange, quiet reverence. His fingers trailed over the cool, veined marble of a column in the Apadana's great hall, his eyes tracing the exquisite reliefs that depicted a dozen subject nations bringing tribute to the King of Kings. He saw the artistry, the staggering achievement, but then his gaze would harden, seeing not the art, but the power it represented, the same power that had sent armies to crush the Greek world, that had burned the Acropolis. His own men, meanwhile, were fracturing. Some stared wide-eyed at the gilded ceilings and lapis lazuli inlays, muttering prayers to their own rough-hewn gods. Others, their avarice overcoming their awe, eyed the wealth with naked hunger, already calculating the weight of gold they could carry. When they finally broke into the treasury, the sheer scale of the hoard stole the breath from even the most avaricious soldier. Piles of gold derricks and silver sigloi filled rooms to the ceiling. Precious fabrics were stacked like cordwood. Gemstones glittered in chests thrown open by anxious Persian stewards. Standing amidst this monument to an empire's wealth, Alexander made his declaration. The city would be spared. His men, weary to their bones, needed rest. They would take the treasure, but they would not destroy its vessel. A collective, relieved sigh went through the ranks. The mood was triumphant, yet the tension remained, a thin wire strung between admiration and the deep, abiding desire to finally, completely break the spirit of the East. Alexander's eyes, as he looked out from the palace steps over his resting army and the silent, opulent city, held both triumph and a deep, unresolved conflict. The great hall of the Apadana, which had so recently echoed with the measured footsteps of conquerors, now thrummed with the chaotic energy of a victory feast. Long, low couches, inlaid with ivory and mother-of-pearl, were arranged around the vast space, their fine silk cushions now bearing the weight of dusty Macedonian soldiers. The air was thick with the scent of roasting lamb and saffron-infused rice, a rich, foreign aroma that mingled with the familiar tang of unmixed wine flowing from golden rhytons into shallow Persian cups. Alexander reclined at the center of the high table, a position once reserved for the great king. He drank at first with a commander's measured control, toasting his generals, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Craterus, their faces lit by the flickering light of 100 oil lamps. The wine was sweet and heavy, a far cry from the harsh vintages of home. With each cup, the rigid line of his shoulders softened slightly, but his eyes, scanning the hall, held a restless energy. Around him, the cultural friction of the day fermented into the night. Macedonian soldiers, unaccustomed to reclining while they ate, fumbled with the low tables, spilling wine on priceless woven rugs depicting intricate hunting scenes. Some attempted to mimic the Persian custom of using only the right hand for eating, their left fists clenched awkwardly at their sides. Others made no such effort, tearing at flatbread and meat with both hands, their laughter too loud in the majestic space. A group of off-duty hypaspists began a raucous drinking song, their coarse voices clashing with the delicate melody of the Persian lyre players stationed in a shadowed corner. Alexander's gaze drifted from his men to the hall itself, to the soaring columns, the polished stone walls etched with endless processions of tribute-bearers. The images of serene kings and obedient subjects seemed to watch the proceedings with silent, stone-carved judgment. His magnanimous mood of the afternoon began to curdle. The opulence was no longer just impressive, it was a provocation. Each sip of wine brought with it a memory not of his own glory, but of Persian arrogance, the arrogance of Xerxes, who had sent his fire across the Aegean to devour the temples of Athens. The wine, once sweet, now tasted of ash. Nearby, among the courtesans and attendants who moved with quiet grace through the tumult, a woman with Athenian features watched the king intently. She said nothing, her presence as subtle as the scent of jasmine that clung to her robes, but her eyes missed nothing: the set of Alexander's jaw, the white-knuckled grip he now had on his golden cup, the dark shadow of an old grievance settling over his face as the feast spiraled deeper into a drunken, simmering tension. The feast spiraled deeper into a haze of wine and simmering resentment. Alexander's earlier control had dissolved. His gestures grew broader, his voice louder, cutting through the din of the hall. He spoke now not of consolidation or mercy, but of past grievances, his words slurred yet sharp with a bitter edge. The burning of Athens, a story every Greek child knew, was no longer a historical fact but a fresh wound in the lamplight, stoked by the foreign luxury that surrounded him. It was then that the Athenian woman, Thais, moved. She had been a quiet observer, but now she approached the king's couch with a dancer's grace, her expression a carefully crafted blend of admiration and challenge. A golden cup rested in her hands, not as an offering, but as a prop. "My Lord Alexander," she began, her voice clear and carrying, though not a shout. It was a voice meant for him alone, yet perfectly pitched to be heard by those nearby. "You sit in the very heart of the monster that sought to devour us. You have humbled the son, Darius, but what of the father? What of Xerxes?" She gestured with her cup toward the towering columns and the reliefs of the triumphant king. "His ghost must be laughing from the shadows of this palace. He watches you feast in his hall and thinks his legacy remains untouched, his insult unavenged." Alexander's eyes, glassy with wine, fixed on her. A deep flush colored his neck and cheeks. He did not look at his generals, at the concerned stillness that had fallen over Hephaestion, who watched with a furrowed brow. He looked only at Thais, at the living embodiment of the grievance he had just been cursing. She leaned closer, her tone taunting, daring. "The Greeks will sing of your victories, yes, but will they sing of the king who had the power to answer the greatest outrage ever committed against Hellas and chose, instead, to merely drink from the culprit's cup?" She let the question hang in the smoky air. What greater glory, what fiercer symbol, than to repay fire with fire, to let the torch that lights your victory procession be the one that burns Xerxes' palace to the ground? The challenge was a spark thrown onto tinder. It appealed directly to the part of him that valued glory above all else, that saw the world in epic gestures. The calculated ruler who had spared the city hours before was gone, submerged by wine and pride and the raw, haunting memory of a burning Acropolis. A wild light entered his eyes. He shoved himself up from his couch, unsteady on his feet, and swept a raiton of wine from the table. "She speaks truth," he roared, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent hall. "Why should we hesitate? Let it be a spectacle for all the world to see. Let it be a message." He turned from her, facing the room, his chest heaving. "Take torches. Now we will give the Persians a funeral pyre worthy of their arrogance. Burn it all." A wave of sound erupted, a mixture of drunken cheers from soldiers eager for any new frenzy, and the stunned silence of others who understood the magnitude of the order. Ptolemy looked away, his face grim. Hephaestion took a half-step forward, his mouth opening to form a word of caution, but it was lost in the king's triumphant shout. The decision was made. It was no longer a strategy. It was an impulse, a grand, terrible gesture unleashed upon the world. The order, once given, became a living thing, spreading through the hall faster than any flame. It was seized by men whose blood was heated by wine and the promise of chaos. Torches were snatched from sconces, their flames guttering wildly as soldiers streamed from the banquet, their shouts echoing through the vast, silent corridors of the palace complex. The first fires were small, almost hesitant, a silk tapestry in an antechamber catching light, a pile of cedar-wood furniture set ablaze in a courtyard. But Persepolis was a city of art, not fortification. It was built of precious, flammable things. The initial, isolated points of light quickly found fuel in the dry timbers of the roof beams, the oil-soaked hangings, the mountains of papyrus scrolls in the archives. The flames began to dance, then to race. From the elevated terrace of the Apadana, Alexander watched the spectacle unfold. At first, his expression was one of fierce, wine-flushed exultation. This was the ultimate symbol, the final answer to Xerxes. The night sky, once a canopy of cold stars, was now painted in violent oranges and reds. He could see his men below, tiny figures against the growing inferno, some working with a frenzied purpose, others simply standing and watching the awesome destruction, their faces masks of awe and terror. But the fire had its own logic, its own hunger. It did not confine itself to the royal quarters where it had begun. Fed by a hot wind funneling through the stone colonnades, it leaped across courtyards and climbed the great columns of the Apadana itself. The gilded capitals caught, melting into rivers of liquid gold that dripped like tears down the carved stone. The intense heat made the very marble of the walls crack with reports like thunder, and the intricate bas-reliefs of kings and heroes blackened and split, their stories erased by the conflagration. Silk banners became fleeting ghosts of ash, swirling upwards on the superheated air. The scale of the destruction began to dwarf the men who had started it. The initial cheers were swallowed by the roar of the fire, a sound like 1,000 waterfalls. The light was no longer celebratory, it was hellish, illuminating a landscape of madness where soldiers now scrambled not to light new fires, but to salvage what they could, their loot made treacherous by the collapsing, burning world around them. Alexander's triumphant posture slowly faltered. The flush of wine and pride drained from his face, leaving a pale, stark realization. His hand, which had so decisively waved the order, now gripped the stone balustrade until his knuckles were white. This was not a controlled, symbolic gesture. This was an unraveling. He was not watching the punishment of a ghost. He was witnessing the annihilation of a masterpiece. The soaring roofs of the Hall of 100 Columns groaned and collapsed in a shower of sparks that lit the entire plain. The unease in his gut tightened into a knot of pure, dawning horror. He was watching beauty and history become irrecoverable ash, and the weight of that loss, far greater than any strategic error, began to settle upon him with the suffocating weight of the smoke. Dawn broke over Persepolis not with light, but with a dull, gray pall. The sun's first rays struggled through a sky still heavy with smoke and ash, casting a sickly bronze glow over the devastation. The roaring inferno of the night had subsided into a landscape of smoldering ruin. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burned cedar, melted metal, and something worse, the ghost of incalculable beauty now vaporized. Alexander walked through the ashes alone, his fine banquet clothes smudged with soot, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. The grandeur of the Gate of All Nations was a skeleton of blackened stone, the benevolent Lamashu now grotesque parodies of themselves, their features melted away. He trod on a mosaic floor, its vibrant colors obliterated, crunching underfoot like broken teeth. The immense, orderly plazas were now a chaotic junkyard of collapsed columns, twisted metal, and piles of white ash that swirled in the morning breeze. He found Hephaestion standing amidst the ruins of the Apadana's great hall, his friend's face mirroring his own hollow disbelief. The soaring columns were stumps. The walls that had told the story of an empire were now blank, heat-blistered slabs. Alexander did not look at him at first. His eyes were fixed on a half-melted golden ornament lying in the cinders, its intricate griffin design warped into a meaningless shape by the terrible heat. He knelt, his movements slow and heavy, and picked it up. It was still warm. It was not just a city, Alexander said, his voice hoarse, stripped of its former thunder. It was a quiet admission, meant for Hephaestion alone in the vast, silent cemetery of stone. It was a testament, a library carved in stone and gold. We did not just burn the palace of a king, we burned the reason he was a king. He finally turned his gaze to his companion, and the regret in his eyes was profound and philosophical, far beyond the tactical error of destroying a symbolic capital. I wanted to answer fire with fire, to make a symbol they would never forget, but a symbol of what? Of our power to break things. He looked back at the wreckage, his shoulders slumping. I see now. It is a far greater thing to build, to preserve, than it is to destroy. I have traded a masterpiece for a moment of rage. I have slain a work of art and called it victory. Hephaestion said nothing. There were no words that could mend this. His silent presence was the only comfort he could offer. Alexander stood, the melted gold piece clutched in his hand, its warmth a fleeting echo of the life it once had. He stared out over the ashes of Persepolis, the scale of the loss finally, fully settling upon him. The line between conquest and legacy, which had once seemed so clear and bold, now felt fragile as smoke. He had crossed it in a night, and the price was the beauty he had, only the day before, vowed to spare. The rising sun illuminated not a triumph, but a pyre, and the man who had lit it stood alone in the cold light of his own sober, introspective folly.